you'll grab your Bibles. Our scripture reading this evening is from 1 Chronicles chapter 4. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Excuse me. I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible. The sons of Judah were Perez, Hezron, Carmi, Hur, and Shobal. And Reiah, the son of Shobal, became the father of Jahath, and Jahath became the father of Ahumiah and Lahad. These were the families of the Zorathites, and I know you would love for me to continue from there, wouldn't you? Skip down to verse 9 with me, if you would. And Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. And his mother named him Jabez, saying, because I bore him with pain. Now, Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, on that thou wouldest bless me indeed, and enlarge my border, and that thy hand might be with me, and that thou wouldest keep me from harm, that it may not pain me. And God granted him what he requested. I might need a drink of water here in just a little bit. If I could send you, honey, to go and, well, I don't know if I need the whole Stanley. We'll take it. You're going to lose your Stanley then up here. My goodness, how do you hide that thing? Just a sip, excuse me. Thank you, sweetie. Whenever you get into reading First Chronicles, it can be a little bit of a drudgery, especially with the pronunciation of those names that are there as we started off with. But there is much that is there if you are to delve into exactly why those names are written. There is some guessing as to why they are listed like they are listed, because they don't follow in exact order. Sometimes someone will appear at the beginning of the lineage and then at the end as well, and so it's almost like you have this sandwiching of the descendants. But it's most important for the Israelites in order that they might know who their ancestors were. We're not for certain who wrote First and Second Chronicles, but we think that we know who wrote them, and we know that First and Second Chronicles has much in it that is similar to Samuel and to Kings, but we think that Chronicles was written by Ezra somewhere around 480 BC. And Ezra and Nehemiah are, of course, the ones that come back from captivity in Babylon and rebuild the temple, and they have the hand in rebuilding the wall as well. And one of the things that takes place when they come back is the establishing of pedigree. And in fact, in Ezra chapter 2, there are some who claim to be priests, but they cannot for sure identify their ancestors and who they were, and so they weren't allowed to become a part of the priesthood since they weren't able to establish their pedigree. Much of the inheritance, not simply priestly duties, but much of the inheritance was tied directly to knowing who your forefather was, who his father was, and who his father was. And so as you read through that chronology, or the generations of the children of Israel, it's more likely that it's like a legal document, and it would be serving very well for the children of Israel so that they would know who they descended from. Can you imagine being required by law that you, in order to have any kind of position of power or wealth, you had to be identify who your ancestors were? We are just so different than what they were back then. We almost have a culture that is kind of a pick yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thing, and we almost lose the significance of who was your father and who was his father and so forth. How far can you go back in your history? But recorded for us here in chapter 4, verses 8 and 9 is these verses about this man named Jabez. Have you ever heard of a little book called The Prayer of Jabez? There's an entire book. It's not actually all that long, but there's an entire book that is just written over these couple of verses. But in the process of looking at this, I believe that there is something significant to be drawn from his example and what he does. Now, Ezra is writing Chronicles, and he has a reason more than just pedigree. Ezra has the intent to answer some of those questions that are upon the hearts of the Jews as they come back from Babylonian captivity. And if you look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles somewhat together as if they were just one book, what immediately strikes you is that the divided kingdom, the northern tribes, have very little mention within Ezra's rendition. And in fact, in the last part of 2nd Chronicles, as Ezra talks about the kings of the divided kingdom or of the schism, the only time that he relates the name of the northern kingdom is whenever they are having interaction with the southern kingdom, or whenever God pronounces judgment upon them, or whenever they are being destroyed because they refuse to obey God. But other than that, Ezra deals very little with unlike 1st and 2nd Kings, with those kings of the divided kingdom. As you look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you are constantly jumping back and forth from Israel to Judah, from Samaria to Jerusalem. And sometimes it can get very confusing because they even have the same names. A king that is on the throne in Samaria would have the exact same name as the king of Judah down in Jerusalem. So it is somewhat confusing. But one of the questions that they come back with from captivity that Ezra is intentionally trying to answer in his recounting of the history is, does the God of Israel still care? And what they have just experienced is decades being away from Jerusalem. Babylonian captivity actually lasted the 70 years, like the prophet Jeremiah said that it would. But it's not at the end of the 70 years that they immediately come back. I mean, it takes some time, and so that's not until somewhere around 480 BC that Ezra comes back along with Nehemiah, and they begin to reestablish Jerusalem. First, building the temple, and then, of course, as we said, to rebuild the temple walls. And so the people have been in this kind of state of limbo by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and there we wept whenever we remembered Zion. And so they have begun to develop a worship that is outside of the temple. And what they actually did was to establish a culture of worshiping down by running water, which Lydia is still practicing whenever Paul discovers her in the country of Macedonia. She was down by the river. We think that that particular style of worship was established during Babylonian captivity. And so whenever they come back to Jerusalem, they want to know, does God still care? Do the promises made to our forefathers, to David, still apply? We, after all, have had no king to sit on the throne. We have been dominated, and their history is going to continue somewhat within that same vein. They are going to continue to be dominated. Currently, whenever Ezra comes back, they are under the thumb of the Medes and the Persians. That's followed by the Greeks with Alexander the Great. That's followed then by the Romans under the Caesars. And so by the time that Christ arrives, they have been for 500 years without a king on the throne. And so it's logical for them to have this question, does God still care, really? If we rebuild his temple, if we rebuild Jerusalem, his capital, is he going to take notice? And so what Ezra does in his recounting of the history and what we are going to see that he emphasizes is the temple. Let me let that soak in for just a minute. The focus of Ezra's writings is the temple. What would the temple have to do with answering the question of, does God still care? Well, it just happens to be the place within the Jewish mind, and God has made it to where he has allowed them to think such, where if he resides there, then they are blessed. It's whenever that temple is destroyed, whenever it's torn down, that it is clearly communicated to the people that they have done something evil and that God has left them. And so in Ezra's writing, starting with chapter 11, you get a little bit of King Saul. But in chapter 11 of 1st Chronicles, on down through the end of the book, what Ezra writes about is David. But it's not just simply anything about David. He doesn't mention anything about David's sins. Do you know what's most important and what you're going to see if you take up the mantle of reading 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles for yourself here afresh, is that he focuses upon David's preparation for the building of the temple. Then you get to 2 Chronicles, and the first 9 chapters are all about Solomon. 9 chapters about David's son? Well, what is it that Solomon does? He builds the temple. David has plans for the temple. Solomon builds the temple. And so you have 30 chapters, including the latter part of 1 Chronicles and the first part of 2 Chronicles, almost 30 chapters of simply the development of the temple. Remember who it is that is writing. It's Ezra. What is Ezra doing? He is laying the groundwork for the rebuilding of the temple again, or it has been completed, and he is honoring the process in which God has led them through, because in the temple there is representation of God's presence. Does God still care? Ezra says, well, yes, he cares, because he has allowed a place to be built in which he can dwell. Now, we know from the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 1 that there is no place that is big enough to contain God. Heaven is his throne. The earth is his footstool. But we know that God allowed for David to prepare and for Solomon to do this because it represented his abiding presence with the people. Then why does Ezra focus only on the kings of southern Judah, mentioning very little about the northern kingdoms? Well, it's because those kings are in Jerusalem, and that's where the temple is. And so I'm just trying to set your mind as you read the rest of 1 Chronicles as well into 2 Chronicles, the concept behind the recording of the history like what Ezra does, and it is for a very specific purpose. And it's not to exonerate David or Solomon, although he doesn't mention Solomon's sins either. He mentions nothing about his idolatry or his foreign wives or his rebellious nature towards the latter part of his life towards God. Instead, he focuses upon the positive concept. And if you think of a people who have been imprisoned, worshiping down by the river, away from the temple, a people that are crying out desperately to have God back within their lives, what Ezra gives them is hope. And he answers the question, yes, God cares. Yes, the God of Israel is your God. Yes, the promises made to David and to his descendants remain. And therefore, we also see that following right along, because of the kings of the southern kingdom are descendants of David. And the good kings are exonerated. Those good kings that come through, like Hezekiah and Joash and Josiah, and Ezra does a good job of showing and focusing that they did the will of God. They wanted to obey, and they were righteous. Why would that give hope to a nation that is struggling to reestablish itself? Because it gives them a foundation that causes them to see this is our calling too. Let us walk with God as well. We are the descendants not simply of a great pedigree, but of a spiritual heritage as well. And as far as we can tell, from this point on, from Ezra's writing on, from the rebuilding of that temple, the reestablishment as Jerusalem, from that time down to Christ, Israel does not go off into idolatrous worship as a nation again. And you might say, wow, Ezra did a really good job of collecting with the Holy Spirit's guidance all of those stories that he could. But it's almost like this concept of patriotism, but it's mixed with the righteousness of the Jewish people. And so he is exonerating, he is holding up those fathers of the nation, and that's what we see taking place as you read through this. David plans, Solomon builds, and you even see the refurbishing of the temple as you go along, right? The finding of the law of Moses in the rubble because of the worship of idolatry and Baal. And some of those kings had even gotten to the point where they were putting idolatrous images within the temple itself. And so we see all of those things that Ezra is highlighting are the ones like Hezekiah, like Josiah, like Joash, those young men who were called forth to refurbish and to reestablish the worship of Jehovah. And so we have this little window, right? But in light of what Ezra's point is, I think it's with Jabez, or almost like a flashing sign that says, this is where I'm headed, and this is what I want you to understand about why I am writing this and what is here. And so in your mind, let's go back and read it again. And I know that this is very dry. You have to admit, but this is so unique. It stands out. And Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother named him Jabez, saying, because I bore him with pain. Now Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, oh, that thou wouldest bless me indeed and enlarge my borders, and that thy hand might be with me, and that thou wouldest keep me from harm, that it may not pain me. And God granted him what he requested. What did you discover about Jabez, or Jabez, however you pronounce it, within the few words? Well, it starts out by saying that he was a man that was more honorable than his brothers. I don't know what his brothers were like, but it says that he was one that walked with honor. What does that mean? Does that mean that he was law-abiding? Well, certainly, I think that it would mean that. Does that mean that he was in good standing with his neighbors? I think that that would be also. But is there something hidden? Is there another layer here that says that he was a man that was more honorable than his brothers? Could it be that that also means that he was a man of faith? And you say, well, yeah, of course. It says right there that he prayed to God. Okay, now, in this, what genealogy is Jabez coming from? Well, if you start off, as we did in chapter 4 and verse 1, where we started in our reading, whose descendant is he? Judah's descendant. Okay, you get to chapter 5 and you're into Simeon's descendants. Now, I'll be honest with you, you cannot always follow the genealogy of Judah's descendants from what we have recorded by Ezra, okay? Because even though it starts off, as it said there, that it was Perez, and then Hezron, Carmi, Hur, and then Shobal, some of those are not all his sons. Some of them are grandsons, okay? And his sons, not even all of them are listed there, but we are in the genealogy of Judah. And for some reason, Jabez is listed here in the midst of all of that. Now, what time period would you say are we in that follows in that genealogy? Okay, we're starting the bookend. You've got Judah starting in chapter 4 and verse 1. Look at chapter 4 and verse 13, and you have someone else that is mentioned there. That name might be familiar. Can you say the 15 judges? Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jer, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Elon, Samuel. Faster than me? No. Who is that first judge? Othniel. Okay, now I told you things don't always flow in order with Chronicles, and you're going to be frustrated if you try to do this all the time, like with a timeline. But let's just suppose that at least we have those bookends for Jabez, okay? That it's after the time of Judah, but yet it's before the time of Othniel. What time period are we in? Well, we know that Judah is the great-grandson of Abraham. Isn't that the way it works, right? Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had the 12 sons, and Judah is right there, okay? And so we know that we are removed at least 3 generations from Abraham whenever we get to Judah. And it's Judah and his brothers, along with Jacob, that go down to the land of Egypt, right? Okay, and depending upon which verse that you're reading within the Bible, it's either 65 souls or 70 souls that go down to Egypt. And so the nation of Israel is very small whenever it goes down to the land of Egypt. Okay, set that aside for a minute and jump in your mind ahead to the time of the judges, to Othniel. What does Othniel represent as the first judge? Well, he is the deliverer of the children of Israel, the conquering of the land of Canaan, right? That was Othniel's job directly after Joshua. And so we are out of Egypt, but we're not a great deal out because by the time of Othniel, he is before that. So Joshua has lived and died, and part of that land has been conquered. Othniel will continue to do that with Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, right? But what we have had happen is the wilderness wanderings and the giving of the law, but that spans a 40-year period up until the time of Joshua's work in Othniel. Okay, so what I am saying is Jabez comes after Judah, and the people of Israel are rather small at that time, 70 souls. with that generation of the descendants, that's what would have happened. Would you allow me to guess whenever Jabez lives? This is what I'm getting around to. Because there are generations that are after Jabez before Othniel. I think Jabez lives in the land of Egypt during those hundreds of years that they sojourned there. Now, as far as being an actual slave in captivity, the Israelites were only like 225 years. But what God said to Abraham was 430 years from now that your people are going to come back and they're going to conquer the land of Canaan. But it's going to be your descendants. 430 years transpire between Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and the judges began and the conquest. And so 430 years, and probably they're only under the bondage some 225 years of that. But the children of Israel live from that time of Jacob's sons, the 70, through the time of the Exodus and into the land of Egypt. You understand what I'm saying? I think that Jabez is actually living in Egypt during the time that they are sojourning there. Now, I can't put my finger on whether he is a slave in captivity or not. Now, why did I go through all of that? You say, I don't have a clue. You do these kind of things to us all the time. What that says is that Jabez likely loved the Lord at a time whenever his people were oppressed. Certainly they were in a foreign land, at least, depending upon whenever he starts his life. And it's interesting because we really don't know who Jabez's sons are, nor who his father is. It's just kind of like out of the blue, Ezra introduces this character. And if you'll notice, as he is describing God, he doesn't say that he prays to the Lord, all caps. What do we understand the Lord, all capitals, to mean? That is Jehovah. That's the Lord's name that was given to Moses. He said to Moses, tell them I am sent you. And that is Jehovah, the best compilation of it by definition. In other words, I have always existed, I exist, and I always will exist. Jehovah is the best definition for the name of God. Ezra here doesn't use that fact that Jabez prays to Jehovah. That's not the Lord that he says there. He says, and he prayed to God, which is the concept of Elohim, which the patriarchs highly used. Another, I think, possible proof that this is happening during the time of Egypt. It's certainly happening after the time of Judah, and Judah ends his life in the land of Egypt. And so it gains significance because it tells us that even in Egypt, there were those that were seeking God. And we can't help but think that whenever Moses' parents were Amram and Jochebed, and they certainly believed in God, and they didn't obey the edict of the Pharaoh to cast their children into the Nile, and instead they made a basket and saved Moses and had his sister look over him. And so I just want to put it into context. Could it be that Jabez lives in Egypt as this is being written about him? And the significance of that would be that you have this idea that not even during that time were they seeing God as being localized. In other words, people develop this concept of God and they can't seem to shake it, that he is the God of a certain area, the God of the mountains, the God of the sea. Remember, even with Jonah, as he was running away from his duties with God, and they asked him, well, what God do you serve? And he said, I serve the God of everything. And they say, well, you can't run from a God like that. Well, here is Jabez praying to the God of his fathers in a foreign land, if my assessment is correct, and he still believes that God has power. An honorable man? I would say certainly. I think that he is in good standing with others, but I also think that he is a patriarch, not yet under the law of Moses. You can contest that and argue with me about that if you would like to later, but just for the sake of my lesson this evening, we'll just say that he is not yet under the law. I think Jabez represents a patriarch who believes that God is with him wherever he goes. And wasn't that the faith that Abraham taught? And isn't that the faith of Ruth the Moabitess? Whether thou goest, I will go. Whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God shall be my God. In the process of pledging her love to Naomi, she has also declared an understanding of God, and that he is wherever she is. And now she has faith in him. That certainly was Jehovah there. And so what does Jabez do? Well, he is evidently in a period of time whenever blessings still mean something. And so perhaps he is just before the time of the slavery. But what he prays to God is, God, please bless me. Do you ever pray that prayer? And you say just every day, like several times a day, Lord, thank you for this day. May it be a day of promise. May I walk with you. Lord, please watch over me and deliver me. Help me and bless me. Do you pray that kind of prayer? Sure we do. In the morning, it might not be before your feet hit the floor, but somewhere along the line, just like Jabez, do we not pray, Lord, bless me? But Jabez has some specific things that he would like from God. He says, enlarge my borders. What does that mean? Does he want to wear a bigger size belt? Enlarge my borders? Enlarge my influence? Possibly. It could mean I want my lands to grow, the things that I possess. I would appreciate being able to gain wealth. But it could be enlarge my influence upon others. Enlarge the idea that I can bring others to know you. Enlarge my borders has many different connotations to it, but in the process of looking at it as simply as possible, what is Jabez doing? He is giving credit to God for who he is, where he is, and what he is. Isn't that great? It's not, God, get me out of this place. It's so hot down here. That's not what Jabez is praying for, if he is, in fact, in Egypt. He's not saying, get me out of here. If he is sensing that they are an oppressed people, which they are to a large degree. They are segregated. They are set apart within the land of Goshen. They have been relegated as shepherds. The pharaohs of the people of Egypt, they look down on them. They don't associate with those that deal with sheep. That's not what Jabez prays for. What does he say? Bless me, God. What has he accepted? Whatever condition he's in, it is in God's hands. Lord, enlarge my borders. May your hand be with me. Jabez says to God, and hold me in your hands. What is he saying to him? Now, we hold hands with people because we love. Because we care, perhaps because we're scared to death. We hold hands because it's security and it's solace and it's comfort. And we believe that the one that we are holding hands with, we can either protect if we are the adult or will protect us if we are the child. Which is it for Jabez? Hold me in your hands, protect me, secure me, because I am dependent upon not my own strength. If I were, I'm lost. Do you see a man here who is more honorable than his brothers? Maybe it was simply because he prayed and they didn't. I don't know what it was about his brothers. But what Ezra is pointing out is a patriarch who walked with God. Doesn't that sound like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Oh, in his glorious form, what Jabez represents is a call back to a people who trusted God. Now think with me again. Let's jump clear back to our introduction, okay? What's the purpose of this book? To answer the question, does the God of Israel still care? Are the promises of God still valid? Even those promises that were made to our forefather King David, are they still in effect? And what does Jabez represent? But that God has always been faithful. It is man who is the fickle one. It is man that makes mistakes. Why did we go into captivity? Ezra might as well have been saying that wasn't God's fault. Those years that we spent in bondage, that wasn't God's fault. We rebelled against God. And he'll point that out. Even those kings of the southern kingdom that don't walk righteously with God, he is going to point out their faults. But we experience that because God loved us enough to punish us and to correct us. But now that time is over. Now we have reconciliation and promise and opportunity. But you say, well, wait a minute. You haven't even dealt with the one that I wanted you to deal with. Why in the world is he named Jabez? You ever heard the song by, I think it was Dolly Parton, there was a trio group that sang, oh, the pain of loving you. Jabez is named sorrow or pain because his mother said, whenever I bore him, it hurt a whole lot. How would you like to be named after that particular instance? What's your name? Oh, I'm just pain. And he almost is like tongue-in-cheek about it. Did you hear it? As he asked God to bless him and to hold him in his hands and to enlarge his borders and deliver him. And he says, so that there be not pain. I think Jabez has a sense of humor, don't you? Jabez is called pain because of an earthly experience that his mother went through, and she saddled him with that name for the rest of his life. It's kind of like Johnny Cash's being a boy named Sue. Why in the world would you name your boy Sorrow or Pain? Well, you say, well, I've had several, and I can understand it. Maybe if you have, as a mother, gone through natural childbirth, or you might be saying it as a father if you've ever raised teenagers. But sometimes children are a pain. And evidently, Jabez's mom wanted to remind him of that every day of his life. Has it influenced him? Not negatively. And in fact, he may have even embraced it. I think he did. He says, God, I know what you can do. You can relieve me of my sorrow. You can relieve me of my pain. He is an honorable man, is he not? Because he trusts in God. Because he longs for God to be his protector. He's not seeking to get out of the situation that he is in necessarily. He simply says, work with me. Give me what you deem necessary, but most of all, don't desert me. Oh, Lord, in your presence is life and happiness and consolation and security. Have we learned this lesson yet? Or do we enjoy being sadistically inclined? A sadist is one who enjoys inflicting pain upon themselves or upon others. That's not Jabez. Sometimes, though, we go through life thinking, I don't need God. And what do? We fall, we fail, we stumble, and we bump our heads against the wall. We go through life rejecting the things that God told us that we need to do, and then we suffer the consequences. Is that acting honorably? No, not hardly. But you say, well, I enjoy learning my lessons the hard way. Okay, let's just hope that you learn those lessons before they're too late. Not Jabez, though. Jabez says, in God's presence, in his embrace, that's where I want to be. Bless me. Oh my God, enlarge my borders. Keep me in your hand. Relieve me from the pain, the things that man would inflict upon me. He was a man of prayer, a man of foresight. He was a man who knew his own weaknesses and a man who trusted in God and wanted to walk in his company. 2 verses, Jabez's prayer, very simple, seeking counsel, seeking direction, seeking the presence of God, a prayer of faith which transformed pain into blessing. If you have your Bibles, we'll go to one last passage. We are closing still. Don't be worried. Turn with me to chapter 10. And I'm not going to expound upon this. Look at verse 13. Just think about what we have been studying with Jabez and think if there could be any other way to give a night and day contrast between 2 men. A man of faith, and then a man who was not. Verse 13, and so Saul died for his trespass, which he had committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord, which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore, he killed him and turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jabez. Could there be any greater contrast between 2 verses? The prayer of Jabez. May I pray such a prayer on a regular basis every morning. May I, like him, seek the presence of the Lord, the strength of the Lord, the guidance of the Lord. As we stand and as we sing.